World War II was filled with terrible events, but one of the darkest was the Marocchinate. In 1944, French colonial soldiers from Morocco unleashed a wave of horror on innocent Italian civilians: rape, murder, and unspeakable cruelty. This is a story of pain, shame, and a tragedy the world tried to forget. What was the Marocchinate? The Marocchinate was a series of brutal crimes committed during World War II by French colonial soldiers from Morocco, known as Goumiers. These soldiers were part of the Allied forces fighting to free Italy from Nazi control. In May 1944, after a major battle at Monte the Goumiers were given permission to roam freely for 50 hours. During this time, they attacked small villages and towns in central Italy, especially in the region of Chioggia. The crimes were horrific. Women, girls, and even elderly women were raped, often in front of their families. Men who tried to protect their loved ones were beaten or killed. Homes were broken into, and anything valuable was stolen. Livestock, food, and money were taken, leaving families with nothing. The attacks were not just random acts of violence. They were organized and widespread, leaving entire communities shattered. Many victims were too scared to speak out. Some were children as young as 11, and others were elderly women in their 70s. Families were torn apart, and survivors were left with deep physical and emotional scars. The violence didn't stop at rape. Some victims were mutilated, and others were forced to watch their loved ones suffer. Entire villages were left in ruins, with no one to help or protect them. The word Marocchinate comes from the Italian word for Moroccan, Maroccino, and refers to the acts committed by these soldiers. It is a term filled with pain and anger, used by survivors to describe the unimaginable suffering they endured. This tragedy is one of the most shameful and overlooked chapters of World War II, a reminder of how war can bring out the worst in humanity. Even today, the full scale of the Marocchinate is unknown. Many records were lost or hidden, and survivors were often too ashamed to come forward. But the stories that have been told paint a picture of pure horror, a dark stain on history that must never be forgotten. If you're finding this story interesting and want to uncover more hidden history, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Why were Moroccan soldiers in Italy? During World War II, Italy became one of the most intense battlegrounds as the Allies pushed to free the country from Nazi control. The war had already taken a devastating toll on Italy, leaving cities in ruins, families torn apart, and people desperate for peace. Among the many soldiers sent to fight on Italian soil were the Moroccan troops, known as the Goumiers, who were brought in as part of the French army under General Alphonse Juin. These soldiers came from small villages and mountain communities in Morocco, a country that was under French colonial rule at the time. For many of these Moroccan soldiers, Italy was a world unlike anything they had ever known. Back home, life was simple and rooted in tradition. The rolling hills of Morocco, the crowded marketplaces filled with the scent of spices, and the quiet evenings spent with family were all part of their daily existence. But war had pulled them into a foreign land, where the sounds of gunfire replaced the laughter of children and ruined villages stood in place of the familiar warmth of home. Most of them had never left their villages before, yet they were now expected to fight in a conflict that had nothing to do with their own people or homeland. The French military used the Moroccan troops as shock soldiers, sending them into some of the most difficult battles of the Italian campaign. These men were known for their toughness, their ability to navigate rough terrain, and their skill in mountain warfare. Their greatest test came at the Battle of Monte Cassino, one of the bloodiest and most crucial battles of the war. The Germans had turned the mountainous region into a fortress, and breaking through their defenses was nearly impossible. The Moroccan soldiers were thrown into the fight, climbing steep hills, charging through enemy fire, and fighting in brutal, close-quarters combat. Their efforts helped the Allies finally break the German hold on central Italy, but at a terrible cost. Many Moroccan soldiers never made it back home. They died on foreign soil, buried in places where no family member would ever visit their graves, their names forgotten by history. For those who survived, the end of the battle did not mean rest or relief. General Juin, eager to reward his troops for their sacrifice, gave them 50 hours of freedom to do as they pleased. What happened next became one of the darkest and most horrifying chapters of World War II. The Moroccan soldiers, many of whom were exhausted, angry, and eager for reward, were let loose upon the Italian countryside. The peaceful villages, where people had barely begun to hope for an end to the war, became places of unimaginable suffering. Women, children, and even elderly men became victims of an unspeakable wave of violence. The people of these small Italian towns had already endured years of war, bombings, and starvation. They had hidden from German forces, suffered through occupation, and longed for the day when the Allies would bring peace. But instead of liberation, they faced a new kind of horror. Families who had once gathered under the shade of olive trees, sharing stories passed down through generations, were now left to mourn their loved ones. The nostalgia of quiet village life, where neighbors looked out for one another, children played freely in the fields, and church bells rang in the distance, was shattered forever. For the Moroccan soldiers, Italy was supposed to be a place where they could prove their bravery, where they could fight and be honored for their courage. But instead, it became a place of shame and sorrow. Many of these men were promised rewards, yet they returned home to a country that barely acknowledged their service. The French military had used them as tools of war, and once their purpose was served, they were cast aside. Some returned to Morocco carrying deep scars, both physical and emotional. Others disappeared into history, their role in the war forgotten by both the French and the people they had fought to liberate. War does not just take lives, it takes memories, it takes innocence, and it takes away the simple joys of life that people once took for granted. The Moroccan soldiers who fought in Italy were part of a tragic and complex story, one that left wounds that would never truly heal. The villages they passed through would never be the same. The people who survived carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. And for those who had once believed in the promise of a better future, the memories of those dark days never faded. War has many untold stories, and we're here to share them. If you're enjoying the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The Horrors Unleashed. The Marocchinate was not just a series of random acts of violence. It was a wave of terror that swept through the peaceful villages of central Italy, leaving behind unimaginable pain and suffering. For the people living in these small, close-knit communities, the days following the Battle of Monte Cassino in May 1944 were a nightmare they could never forget. The Goumiers, Moroccan soldiers under French command, were given 50 hours of freedom after the battle. Instead of targeting enemy soldiers, they turned on innocent civilians. Women, girls, and even elderly women were their primary victims. The attacks were brutal and widespread. Women as young as 11 and as old as 80 were raped, often in front of their families. Men who tried to protect their loved ones were beaten, tortured, or killed. Some were forced to watch as their wives, daughters, or mothers were assaulted. One survivor, Maria, was just 14 years old when the Goumiers stormed her village. She later recalled, "They broke into our home like wild animals. My father tried to stop them, but they knocked him to the ground. I screamed, but no one came to help. They took turns hurting me, and I thought I would die. When they finally left, my family was broken. We never spoke of it again, but the pain never went away." The violence didn't stop at rape. Homes were looted, and anything of value was stolen. Livestock, food, and money were taken, leaving families with nothing to survive on. In some cases, entire villages were burned to the ground. The Goumiers showed no mercy, even to those who begged for their lives. One elderly woman, Lucia, remembered, "They took everything. Our food, our clothes, even the crucifix from our wall. When my husband tried to stop them, they stabbed him in front of me. I couldn't even cry. I just sat there, numb. Children were not spared. Many were forced to watch as their mothers and sisters were attacked. Some were raped themselves. A boy named Giovanni, who was only 10 at the time, said, "I hid under the bed when they came, but they found me. They hurt my sister first, then they came for me. I didn't understand what was happening. I just kept thinking, why is this happening to us? What did we do wrong?" The psychological toll was immense. Survivors were left with deep emotional scars that never healed. Many women felt ashamed, as if the attacks were their fault. They were afraid to speak out, fearing they would be judged or rejected by their communities. Some were abandoned by their husbands or families. Others were forced to marry their attackers to avoid shame. A woman named Rosa shared, "After it happened, my husband couldn't look at me. He said I was ruined. I felt like I had no worth, like I was nothing." The physical consequences were just as devastating. Many women suffered severe injuries from the attacks. Some died from their wounds, while others were left unable to have children. Pregnancies resulting from rape were common, and the babies born from these assaults were often called children of the enemy. These children faced a lifetime of stigma and rejection. One survivor, Anna, said, "When my son was born, everyone knew what had happened. They called him names and treated him like an outcast. He didn't deserve that. He was innocent." The Goumiers also targeted men, especially those who tried to resist. Some were beaten or tortured, while others were killed. In one village, a group of men was tied to trees and used for target practice. A survivor named Paolo recalled, "They made us watch as they shot my brother. They laughed while he screamed. I thought they would kill me next, but they just left me there, tied to the tree. I still have nightmares about that day." The attacks were not random. They were organized and systematic. The Goumiers moved from village to village, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. In some cases, they were led by their officers, who did nothing to stop the violence. One survivor, Francesca, said, "I saw the French officers watching as the soldiers attacked us. They didn't care. They just stood there smoking cigarettes, as if it was a game." The Italian resistance fighters, known as partisans, tried to protect their communities, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. In some areas, the partisans managed to fight back, but it was not enough to stop the wave of violence. A partisan named Marco said, "We did what we could, but it was like trying to stop a flood. There were too many of them, and they were too strong. All we could do was try to save as many people as possible." The horrors of the Marocchinate were not limited to physical violence. The psychological impact was just as devastating. Survivors lived in constant fear, afraid that the soldiers would return. Many felt betrayed by the Allies, who they had hoped would bring freedom and peace. Instead, they experienced a new kind of terror. A woman named Julia said, "We thought the war was over when the Allies came. We thought we would be safe. But the Goumiers were worse than the Nazis. They took everything from us. Our dignity, our hope, our future." The Marocchinate left a lasting mark on the communities it touched. Entire villages were destroyed, and families were torn apart. The survivors carried the weight of their trauma for the rest of their lives, often in silence. A man named Antonio, who lost his wife and daughter in the attacks, said, "I never remarried. I couldn't. Every time I looked at another woman, I saw my wife's face. I couldn't forget what happened. It was like a shadow that followed me everywhere." The aftermath and silence. The horror of the Marocchinate did not end when the war moved on. Instead, it left behind shattered lives, broken families, and deep wounds that time could never fully heal. The villages of central Italy, once filled with laughter and simple joys, became places of sorrow. Survivors, especially the women, were left to deal with both physical and emotional scars, while many children were born as a result of the assaults, often facing rejection from their own communities. For years, silence surrounded the tragedy. The victims were often blamed or ignored, forced to carry their pain alone. Many women never spoke about what had happened, fearing shame and judgment. It was as if history had tried to erase their suffering, pretending that these crimes had never occurred. Even Italy itself struggled to acknowledge the Marocchinate. Official reports were hidden, and many survivors went to their graves without justice. The Allied forces, who had brought both liberation and horror, did not take responsibility, leaving the victims feeling abandoned. Yet, despite the silence, the memories remained. Those who lived through it never forgot the fear, the helplessness, and the loss. Even today, echoes of the Marocchinate linger in the stories passed down by families, in the old photographs of once happy villages, and in the eyes of those who still remember. Remembering the victims. For many years, the tragedy of the Marocchinate remained hidden, spoken of only in whispers among survivors and their families. The pain was so deep, and the shame placed on the victims was so unfair, that many chose to stay silent. It wasn't until books and films like La Ciociara, 1960, brought the story to the world's attention that people began to understand what had happened. The film, starring Sophia Loren, was based on a novel by Alberto Moravia and told the heartbreaking story of a mother and daughter who suffered at the hands of the Moroccan troops. The movie shocked audiences, forcing many to confront the dark reality of these crimes for the first time. Today, activists and historians continue to fight for recognition of the Marocchinate. In many towns, such as Esperia, monuments and memorials have been built to honor the victims. These memorials stand as a reminder of the pain that thousands of innocent people endured, and as a warning about the hidden horrors of war. Every year, small ceremonies are held in some of these towns, where people gather to remember those who suffered and to make sure their voices are never forgotten. Despite this, justice remains out of reach. France and the United Nations still refuse to call these crimes war crimes. Instead, they refer to them as collateral damage, as if the suffering of thousands of women, children, and men was just an unfortunate side effect of war. This refusal to acknowledge the truth has only added to the pain of the survivors and their families. However, remembering the Marocchinate is not just about seeking justice, it is also about learning from history. It reminds us that war is not just about battles and strategies, it is also about the innocent people caught in the crossfire. The horrors that happened in Italy during World War II serve as a warning that civilians must always be protected, no matter the circumstances. As time passes, fewer and fewer survivors remain to tell their stories. That is why it is important for future generations to continue remembering them. Their pain should not be forgotten, and their suffering should not be dismissed. The Marocchinate was one of the darkest events of World War II, and history must never be allowed to bury it again. The story of what happened in Italy during World War II is one that many people don't know about, but it's something that should never be forgotten. War is not just about battles and victories. It also brings suffering to innocent people, leaving scars that last for generations. The people of Italy, who had already been through so much, faced horrors they never expected. And the Moroccan soldiers, who were sent to fight in a land that was not their own, became part of a tragedy that still haunts history. Remembering these events is important, not just to honor those who suffered, but to make sure that such things never happen again. War should never give people the right to take away the dignity and lives of others. No matter where they come from, no matter which side they are on, people deserve to live in peace. If you found this story important and want to learn more about hidden history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many untold stories from the past that deserve to be heard. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an update, and let's keep history alive together. Thanks for watching.